people in Singapore and Malaysia have to understand that almost the rest of the world looks at China unfavorably. They look at the U.S. favorably, and they look at China unfavorably.
Our last topic this morning is a new poll that has come out, surveyed by the Pew Research Trust, saying that by and large, across 19 countries, more people see the U.S. than China favorably, but at the same time, they're saying that Chinese influence is growing. So there's a lot to unpack in this huge survey, but that was one of the top line.
You know, and what I've started doing this week, I'm back on the road doing my speaking tour on the U.S. midterms, right? And so I was in KL for an event this week. I did one in Singapore this week. And one of the things that is really important to Southeast Asia is, what should Southeast Asia be watching for the midterm elections coming up in the U.S.? What happens if the Republicans take the House and or the Senate? What is that going to mean for U.S. policy, congressional and an executive and foreign policy for this part of the world, especially when it comes to U.S. China? And one of the messages I deliver, and the Pew poll really underscores this, is that the people in Singapore and Malaysia have to understand that almost the rest of the world looks at China unfavorably. They look at the U.S. favorably, and they look at China unfavorably. And the only
even places like Africa, and it's getting investment and things like that.
No, that not Africa, but right of the 19 countries that were polled in Pew, that were surveyed: North America, Europe, and Asia.
The
right?
key markets.
The key 19 markets. Yep. That of those 19 countries, the only two that viewed China more favorably than the U.S. were Singapore and Malaysia. Every of the other 17 countries viewed the U.S. more favorably than China, and every one of those other 17 countries had a negative view, a net negative view towards China. And so what I have to explain to the audiences here in Singapore and Malaysia, you need to understand the rest of the world looks at China much differently than you do. And when we were on the door knock as the AmChams of Asia Pacific in Washington, D.C., what we were
talking to various parties,
government officials, we would say, you need to understand that Singapore and Malaysia have a very favorable view of China and an unfavorable view of the U.S. And so the interesting question, now politically, you have to take this into account when you make your decision making. And the other interesting question, though, is why? Why is it that Singapore and Malaysia are outliers in their favorable view of China compared to the other 17 countries that don't have that view?
Well, we kind of know why, right? It's not that big a leap to work out why. I mean, we're a majority Chinese country here. Many of our forebears and forefathers go back to that country. If you speak to older Singaporeans in this country, many of my friends still have a relatively favorable view of the country because of their own literal cultural linguistic ties to that country. Malaysia, of course, has a large Chinese component to it as well. So it's that part of it is not so surprising. I think what's more surprising, perhaps, is it is changing, right, amongst younger people.
But well, if I can just throw in one thing, I mean, the U.S. is the largest single FDI investor in Singapore, the largest single trading partner with Singapore. I mean, when you look at the business ties, cultural ties,
what does that mean to the average family in an HDB flat?
Well, if they're not getting the message how important that is, then that's maybe a communication error, right? For sure.
Cultural affinity certainly explains part of it. Yeah. But when you also, in this poll, one of the questions was, do you have more confidence in Biden or Xi? And in every of the 17 countries, right, all of them were mostly in the teens in terms of their confidence in Xi, and they were in the in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Poland 82%, right, had more confidence in Biden than Xi. The only countries that had more confidence in Xi than Biden were Malaysia at 62% and Singapore at 69%. That doesn't cultural affinity doesn't explain that. You can have affinity for China and think the leadership is not that you don't have confidence in the leadership. So it's more than that. And so the question is why. I mean, one of the theories that my friends tell me here is that look at, for example, the distrust that people had here, the older generation had here with the vaccine, the COVID vaccines, and they insisted on Sinovac. Whereas if you saw any study anywhere, it's that Sinovac doesn't work. And it certainly doesn't work as well as Pfizer and Moderna and the others and the mRNA vaccines. Yet they supported Sinovac. They would only take Sinovac.
Right.
Why would that be? And one of the theories is because you get a lot of the Chinese PRC media here, which is very different than the media you get in the West, and certainly that you get at SPH or there's and the Straits Times and the newspaper, Channel News Asia. It's very different media, and they're listening to that Chinese media. So I don't think it's just cultural affinity, but it really has serious implications for the foreign policy that the Singapore government wants to have, the Malaysian government wants to have, and that the U.S. government wants to have.
And of course, we've seen the Singapore government, pretty well balance that relationship between Washington and Beijing over the decades. It is it's a tightrope walk, but starting with Lee Kuan Yew and now Lee Hsien Loong, they've been managing that, I would say, from my outside perspective, quite well.
But again, it's not just the U.S. Look at the pushback on sanctions that you've heard in the press from local Singaporeans against the Russian sanctions, where Singapore put sanctions on Russia because of their invasion of Ukraine. So it is a very important driver of popular opinion that the Singapore government is doing a good job, but continues to need to do a good job to balance. And where I bring this back to what's going to happen going forward. So if the Republicans get the House or Senate, it now means that the Democrats cannot dictate what happens legislatively in the Congress. And so it's going to be much more difficult to pass anything like on climate change, like on taxes, like on everything that goes into those Democratic only bills that passed under the Inflation Reduction Act. So what happens? It means the only thing that can pass is where the Republicans and the Democrats totally agree. Where do they totally agree? China. So you are going to see a lot more, I think, legislation, even more so in a split government than a unified government, against China on outbound investment restrictions, on increasing sanctions like you have now for products coming out of Xinjiang, for more restrictions when it comes to technology. And that is going to impact businesses all over Asia, because if you're doing business in the U.S. and you're manufacturing in China, it doesn't matter that you're a Singapore headquartered business. You now have to comply with those new U.S. laws. And that is going to be in conflict to Chinese laws. So what do you do as a business when you are now caught between the two? And that's why I think watching these midterm elections is so important for the people of Singapore and Malaysia and everywhere else that
Can I just follow up with one quick question? And that is, in my news this morning at the top of the hour, it was the announcement of this 2-day summit in Los Angeles that's just finished. The Biden administration pulled together 14 countries talking about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, right? Which is a new trade or oversight something. We're not sure what it is. And all of the ministers there agreed that we've got to double down on supply chain resilience or whatever. Now, just briefly, in a couple of minutes, based on what you've seen in the media today already, has that conference meant anything? Is it going to be valuable to the future of supply chain resilience? Well,
wait, here's the starting point. The U.S. has been out of the game for the last 5-6 years when it comes to trade and economic integration in Asia Pacific. We the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so we're not in that trade agreement. China is in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, along with all of ASEAN and Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. So the U.S. is out of the game. The Biden administration has said we are not going to do any trade agreements because that is too difficult politically to get through the Congress. So we need to come up with an alternative framework. This alternative framework, which is not a trade agreement, is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. There are 14 countries that are part of this. It is split into 4 pillars. One pillar is on trade, and a focus within that on digital trade, which is so important to the 21st century. Another focus, as you mentioned, is on supply chain and supply chain resilience. Part of that is, what are you going to do on supply chain if there's another pandemic? A huge issue facing the businesses here. It's not just, of course, it's the U.S.-China trade tensions, but maybe even more so, it's COVID-0 and what China is doing in COVID-0 and how that is shutting down factories and how that is shutting down supply chains. So you've got to make your supply chain more resilient. The way you can do that, in part, is diversifying it. taking some of that manufacturing out of China. Where is it going to go? How are you going to do this? So it can be a very good discussion for these 14 countries to come together to talk about how do we make our supply chains more resilient. Getting back to the China question, though, this can't be seen as a China containment policy, because if it is, Singapore and Malaysia are going to have a very difficult time doing so vis-a-vis their own people, and as well as vis-a-vis how is China going to react to that? And everybody agrees, of course, in the Pew Survey, everybody agrees China is growing more and more important.